The flow of information in any system has its own language. For example, you've learned in great detail last term how the computer program Mathematica has its own language and you've learned how to use it. You might have also painfully learned, as I did, that you must have the Mathematica language constructed correctly to begin with in order for the flow of information to be useful. An example of a language designed for information flow between people would be the English language. Likewise, the area of circuitry has its own language. Starting from examples in the English language, you're going to be exposed to the basic language of circuitry in this lecture video. Most importantly, you will see how the incoming input information is handled by the processor is pivotal to the decision-making process. This idea of taking and processing the information in a specific way is what underlies what we more generally refer to as the logic of the system. To begin, a simple example of logic used in the English language is shown here. It's this thing we call a proposition. A proposition is a declarative sentence that can be answered with a simple yes or no or true-false answer. Essentially, the logic of the system is bound by this requirement that only one of the two choices can be chosen. We can refer to these choices as the truth value and give them a symbol. For convenience, we universally use 1 as the truth value for a true answer, and the truth value for false answer is 0. To link this with circuitry, consider the following examples where the proposition sentence itself is the input and you are then the processor that decides on the answer to the sentence. This first example is indeed a proposition, and therefore our true-false logic can be applied. This example also shows that an alphabet isn't the only way humans can communicate information, but symbols may also be used. You should be able to see for yourself that the proposition statement is true, and thus it has a truth value of 1. This value would be the output information from the processor. In this second example, again, the sentence is indeed a proposition, and depending upon when you actually view this video, you should be able to assign a truth value. Likewise, this third example is indeed a proposition, but we cannot answer it until tomorrow. This instance shows how sometimes an information processor will not be able to immediately give an output because other parameters need to be met first. In this next case, we can see that our true-false logic cannot be applied to this sentence because it is not a proposition that can be answered in this way. The only way for this sentence to be a proposition is if we were to also state that x equals 2. And finally, this last example again shows a proposition that has a false value of 0. We begin our introduction to the language that is used in circuitry by using one of the easiest examples for how we would go about using a proposition sentence to establish the overall logic of the circuit. This first type of logic that can be imposed on the circuit is a negation or inverter. To begin, we start with a proposition. In this case, we use the symbol P to represent this starting proposition. The overall logic of the processor is the inversion or negation of P. This can be read as not P, which is why we also refer to the logic of this circuit using the more simple term, a not gate. Recall once again that a circuit, or the individual elements of a larger circuit system, are universally known as a gate. If we take a look at precisely how a not gate would process the information, we use truth values to describe what is happening, and we can summarize the overall logic of the gate into something we call a truth table. The truth table for any not gate is shown here. Hopefully you can make the connection at this time that the logic of this table can be envisioned as a flow of information, where a given input is processed to give an output. Notice how we've also used the basic logic symbol for not in the truth table. For your own information, a summary of the basic logic symbols can be found online at the address at the bottom of this slide. A number of them you may have already seen throughout your studies. You will not be tested on the basic logic symbols, such as the one shown here. We can begin to understand how to read and use this table by first establishing a proposition sentence that can be answered by a true-false answer. For example, we can make the proposition statement P is present. If we look at the first row, the input truth value is 1, and we know that the logic of the processor is designed to invert this value, meaning that the output will be a truth value of 0. To think of this in another way, if we can go back to the original statement P is present, and again what you're told is that the input truth value is 1, this means that the original statement can be answered as being true. Since the processor is designed to invert this value to the opposite, this is why we see a final output of 0. Given that all NOT gates will have the same truth table, means we can simplify the circuitry language even further down to a basic symbol for the gate. Please note that you will be expected to know and be able to use the basic gate symbols that are described in this lecture series. A NOT gate symbol is now shown here. Next, we can write the input truth value possibilities on one side of the diagram and the output possibilities on the other side. Hopefully you can see the overall summary of the logic for the NOT gate using these methods. It is important to note that sometimes when the NOT symbol is used in publications, such as the McAdams reference cited here, that the little circle is not visible or not used entirely. To avoid confusion in this module, the symbol we will always use for NOT gate in the lecture slides, lab practical documentation, and assessment or quiz questions is the one shown on the left, where the little circle is absent. Building upon the concepts presented for the NOT gate, a second type of logic proposition and its truth table is shown here. In this case, we can see that it differs from the NOT gate in that we have two input signals. When there are two inputs, we refer to this situation using a general term known as a compound proposition. The overall logic of the compound proposition described here takes on the form of a conjunction, meaning that the two individual propositions or factors must independently be present and true in order for the processor to be satisfied and to give a final output decision that is true. We also refer to this type of gate as an AND gate or multiplication gate. Why multiplication? Hopefully you can see from the truth table that if we were to use a multiplication symbol in the place of the basic logic symbol, and we were to substitute in the values for P and Q respectively, you'll find that the multiplied answers are exactly what you would find in the output column of the truth table. We can also assign a universal gate symbol to this AND gate, which is now shown here. To give you a few examples, let's consider the starting input truth values are 1 and 1. Just as we did for the NOT gate, we could think of this as the two individual proposition sentences, P is present and Q is present. The gate would then process these input truth values, and in this example would come to the conclusion that both propositions are true. The logic of the AND gate then dictates that the final output would also be true, or 1, because the conditions needed for this response were satisfied. You'll notice that the truth table for the AND gate is somewhat easier to remember relative to some of the other gates, because only this one particular situation outlined here in example 1 will lead to an output truth value of 1. In example 2, we can see that one of the individual propositions would be interpreted by the processor as false, and thus this leads to a final output of false or 0 because the logic needed for the true response was not satisfied. The final logic we'll discuss in this video can almost be viewed as the opposite case to what we saw with the AND gate. This example is also a compound proposition, but in this case the overall logic takes on the form of a disjunction. You'll notice that the truth table for this gate can be relatively easy to remember as well. The idea is that the overall logic that would allow for the processor to be satisfied and to give a final output decision that is true is established when either of the two inputs are true. It doesn't matter whether only one is true or they both are true. Either way, the logic of the processor is satisfied. Accordingly, we also refer to this type of situation as an OR gate, or sometimes an addition gate. Similar to the description for why the truth table for the AND gate could be thought of as a multiplication table, so can the OR gate be thought of as an addition table, except that it basically only takes one input proposition to be true for the logic in the processor to be flipped in a manner that yields the output truth value of 1. You could think of the second input value as more or less being redundant. We can also assign a universal gate symbol to this OR gate, which is now shown here. To once again give you a few examples, let's consider the starting input truth values are 1 and 1. Just as we did for the AND gate, we could think of this as the two individual proposition statements P is present and Q is present. The gate would then process these input truth values and, in this example, would come to the conclusion that both propositions are true. The logic of the OR gate then dictates that the final output would also be true, or 1. In example 2, we can see that at least one of the individual propositions is true, and thus this also leads to a final output value of 1 or true. Lastly, it's only when both input values are 0 do we see that the final output is 0. This now concludes your introduction for how to use the language and symbols that are a part of the general field of circuitry. The key information described in this video is also highlighted here for your reference. In the next video, we'll continue our analogy of how a cell can be thought of as a computer by describing how these same principles of circuitry are integrated into a computer system.